Nazi Germany might now control most of Western Europe, but Britain's Prime Minister Winston Churchill had no intention of letting it have an easy time.
We shall not flinch from the supreme trial. All will come right out of the depths.
Even before France had surrendered, he was looking for ways of striking back and of keeping resistance alive in the countries which had been overrun. Just as the last troops were being taken off the beaches of Dunkirk, Churchill was already planning ahead. He wrote to his chiefs of staff demanding the formation of raiding forces which could attack the coasts of occupied Europe. Within a few days, a call for volunteers had been circulated to create a force of 5,000 men. They were to be called commandos, after the highly mobile Boer units which had fought the British for 3 years in South Africa at the turn of the century. 10 commando units, each of 500 men, were set up. They began practicing attacks from the sea. One unit was ordered to specialize in parachuting and using assault gliders. This soon became the basis of the separate parachute regiment. Admiral Sir Roger Keyes was appointed Director of Combined Operations. Churchill instructed him to prepare to mount 3 major raids as soon as the threat of an invasion of Britain had passed. One of Keyes' first tasks was to develop ships which could land his new troops. 3 cross-channel ferries were converted so as to carry landing craft. On March the 4th, 1941, 2 commando units and a demolition squad were landed on the Lofoten Islands off northern Norway. Their main objective was to destroy factories which converted fish oil into glycerine for explosives. The commandos achieved total surprise and landed without a shot being fired. A German armed trawler in the harbour was seized. They quickly destroyed the factories and the fish oil tanks. One officer could not resist using the local post office to send a telegram to A. Hitler, Berlin. It read, "Reference your last speech. I thought you said that wherever British troops land on the continent of Europe, German soldiers will face them. Well, where are they?" The commandos then rounded up 60 Norwegian collaborators and 225 German prisoners before returning without any losses. With them, they also took 115 Norwegian volunteers. These would then join the Free Norwegian Forces in Britain. The Lofoten raid was an enormous public relations success and a huge boost for British morale. But its most important result was one which could not be publicized: the capture of a set of rotors for an Enigma machine. Although the machine had been thrown overboard from the armed trawler, its crew forgot the spares. They were to give invaluable help to the cryptographers of Bletchley Park in breaking the German naval codes. Then in December 1941, 4 commando units landed at the Norwegian port of Vagsø and were immediately involved in heavy fighting. The approach to Vagsø was covered by the small island of Malø, on which the Germans had placed artillery. This was quickly overrun, but across the water in Vagsø, the fighting was intense. It took several hours for the main German garrison to be subdued. commandos then blew up several factories and sank 8 ships before withdrawing. These raids convinced Hitler that sooner or later the British would attempt to retake Norway. So for the remaining 4 years of the war, he kept some 250,000 troops there. Troops which might have proved vital on other fronts. But effective as they were, commando raids were not enough to stop the Nazis. Churchill needed other ways to hurt them, so he focused on the resistance movements in the occupied countries. In July 1940, a Special Operations Executive, SOE, was formed, as Churchill put it, to set Europe ablaze. Its objectives were to encourage sabotage of the enemy war effort, gather intelligence and prepare clandestine forces to disrupt German defenses. The bulk of SOE's activities centered on France. Soon agents were recruited in Britain to build up and coordinate the French resistance networks. Radio operators and couriers were also trained to support them. One problem was how to get these teams into the country. Submarines, high-speed launches and fishing vessels were all tried out, but the German coastal defenses proved difficult to penetrate. The answer was aircraft. And in August 1940, a special RAF unit was set up with Whitley bombers and short takeoff and landing Westland Lysanders. Agents and equipment were either parachuted in from the bombers or flown in and brought out by the Lysanders. On moonlit nights, a growing number of reception committees would be waiting as an increasingly widespread network of resistance groups was built up. But all the while, they were hunted by an increasingly sophisticated German counter-espionage system. This used direction-finding equipment to locate hidden radios and double agents to infiltrate networks. The work of SOE agents was desperately perilous, and their life expectancy short. The slightest lapse in concentration might betray them to the Gestapo. Many suffered torture and death. But Churchill was sure it was worth it. Keeping resistance alive in the occupied countries gave hope to millions that liberation would eventually come. The British Broadcasting Corporation, the BBC, was also enlisted to raise the hopes of those living under German rule. They broadcast the news in all the languages of the occupied countries.
Grand raid de l'aéronaval allié sur une concentration de transport japonais.
The German penalty for listening to these bulletins was death. But people tuned in regardless. The BBC also played a crucial role in transmitting coded messages to resistance groups. These always came after the 9 o'clock news.
Message très important pour le chef de Gaël. Attention, il va pleuvoir bougrement ce soir.
For the peoples of occupied Europe, the prospect of liberation might only be a distant dream, but in the middle of 1941 it suddenly became more likely. For by then, Britain was no longer alone in fighting Nazism. It had gained a massive ally, but it wasn't America, which Churchill had assiduously been courting. It was the Soviet Union.
Glücklich sein zu wissen, dass diese Zukunft Rest machtlos uns gehört.
Adolf Hitler had never disguised his belief that the Soviet Union would be his regime's ultimate enemy.
Der sich als Träger seines besten Blutes fühlen und dieses wissend zur Führung der Nation.
He hated communism and saw the vast open spaces and abundant natural resources of Soviet Russia as the prize which would finally enable the German people to become the master race. Throughout the early months of 1941, as he stayed at the Berghof, his country retreat in the Bavarian Alps, Hitler planned his greatest gamble. Operation Barbarossa, the assault on the Soviet Union. Steadily, his armies were redeployed to the east and re-equipped for what would be their greatest challenge. In theory, Stalin's Soviet Union was still Hitler's ally, and Stalin was keen to keep it that way, for his country was woefully unprepared for war. The mighty Red Army, once the largest and most technologically advanced in the world, had been devastated by Stalin's purges in the late 1930s. Some 3/4 of its senior officers had been shot or imprisoned. Despite appearances, there had been a catastrophic collapse in morale and efficiency. As German soldiers now flooded into neighboring Poland, Stalin, desperate to maintain the peace, gave orders that nothing should be done to offend Hitler. But Hitler had one other task to perform before he could push on to Russia. He needed to secure his southern flank. Romania, Bulgaria and Hungary were Germany's firm allies. But in March 1941, a Yugoslav government sympathetic to Germany was overthrown by pro-British forces. Its next-door neighbour Greece was also pro-British. So, on April the 6th, 1941, the German army invaded the Balkans. "33 German divisions moved into Yugoslavia. They swiftly tore its defences apart. The capital, Belgrade, surrendered on April the 12th. Greece fell almost as quickly. Despite British help, Athens was captured in less than 3 weeks. The way was now clear for Operation Barbarossa. Over 4 million men were to be deployed. They were supported by more than 3,000 aircraft. The plan called for 3 simultaneous thrusts. Army Group North would overrun the Baltic states and seize Leningrad. Army Group Center was to advance to Moscow. And Army Group South would occupy the Ukraine. Hitler's generals went silent when he showed them the plan. They were worried it was too ambitious and would spread their forces too thinly. But none dared voice their doubts. The Red Army was much bigger. It had nearly 2 million men within striking distance of the Western Front and millions more in reserve. The Russians also had more than 20,000 tanks, far outnumbering Germany's 6,000. They were older and less powerful, but they were still a formidable fighting force. The issue for Germany was, could its superior technology and speed overwhelm the Russians before the Red Army's vast numbers ground them down? Operation Barbarossa began at 3:15 a.m. on June the 22nd, 1941. The Luftwaffe joined in at dawn, targeting Soviet airfields. Simultaneously, the ground attack began. The Germans swiftly crossed the River Bug on the border between Poland and the Soviet Union. Hitler's panzers were soon thrusting deep into Soviet territory. Within 2 days, the panzers had penetrated more than 50 miles. Ill-coordinated Red Army counterattacks were swiftly brushed aside. Tens of thousands of Soviet prisoners were rounded up. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe had total domination of the air. The Red Army's leadership seemed paralyzed by the German onrush. On June the 29th, 7 days after the start of the assault, 2 panzer thrusts met up near Minsk, surrounding huge pockets of Soviet troops. As the follow-up infantry arrived, more than 300,000 prisoners were taken. Often the Germans found themselves welcomed as liberators, particularly in the Ukraine, where anti-Russian feeling was widespread. In Moscow, Stalin appeared to have suffered a near breakdown at the news of his betrayal by Hitler. He remained silent for more than a week. Not until July the 3rd did he appeal to his people's patriotism to save the motherland. In Britain, the Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, received the news of Operation Barbarossa with very different feelings. It meant the country no longer stood alone. He announced that any enemy of Nazi Germany was a friend of Britain's, no matter what the political differences in the past. He then sent a mission to Moscow to sign a treaty of mutual assistance with Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov. But apart from sending aid by sea, there was little Britain could do immediately to help the Soviet Union. As June turned to July, the German blitzkrieg slashed deeper into Soviet territory. It was beginning to look as if nothing could stop Hitler, but he was about to make his first major strategic blunder. By the beginning of 1942, Adolf Hitler was the master of Western Europe and huge tracts of the Soviet Union. The Nazi Empire was controlled by the methodical application of punishment, reprisal, and terror. Hitler's new order in Europe was designed solely to serve the interests of Germany. Those who stood in its way were given short shrift. The people of occupied Europe were as much Hitler's captives as the tens of thousands of Allied troops languishing in prisoner-of-war camps. One of these camps gained a legendary reputation. This was the forbidding castle fortress of Colditz. It housed two types of prisoner, those with important political connections and servicemen who had a record of escapes from other camps. Their German captors regarded Colditz as escape-proof. The escapers waged a secret war to prove them wrong. But even when these brave men had broken out of Colditz, they faced a daunting journey through occupied Europe which demanded enormous reserves of enterprise and nerve. They had escaped from one fortress into another, infinitely bigger and fraught with peril. Hitler's Fortress Europe. Only the boldest and the luckiest could look forward to the sight of the white cliffs of Dover at the end of their home run from Colditz. Prisoners of war and the problems of handling them are phenomena as old as warfare itself. Nearly 2,000 years ago, the reliefs on Trajan's column recorded the triumphs of the Roman legions and the humiliation of their enemies. Death or the galleys awaited the men captured on the field of battle. In the American Civil War, the first conflict of the modern era of warfare, prisoners on both sides suffered and died in primitive conditions. During the First World War, the treatment of prisoners was regulated by the terms of an international treaty signed at The Hague in 1899. This stated that prisoners must be humanely treated and not obliged to divulge military information other than name, rank, and number. On the Western Front, the life of a prisoner of war assumed a shape that was to become familiar in Europe a quarter of a century later. A pattern was established. The first stage was the march away from the fighting to the rear. The camps German prisoners built with their own hands in the First World War would have been recognized by veterans of the Second. Single-story huts surrounded by barbed wire fences. Roll calls were a monotonous feature of camp life. And for the men, boredom was kept at bay by physical labor. Each camp became a small world of its own. While work parties gave an occasional glimpse of the world which lay beyond the wire. In the Second World War, the massive hauls of men captured in battle presented an acute problem, not least on the Eastern Front, where millions of Red Army soldiers fell into German hands in the first year of fighting. It was a problem the Germans chose to ignore. They considered the Russians subhuman and treated them as such. Those prisoners who did not die on the forced marches back to Germany were worked to death when they got there. In the winter of 1942, the boot was on the other foot. At Stalingrad, the Russians surrounded an entire German army. The German survivors of the battle for Stalingrad surrendered at the beginning of February 1943. The red flag was raised over the shattered city. Of the 100,000 German troops who tramped into Russian captivity, barely 5,000 survived the war. They set out on a death march every bit as hellish as that inflicted on their Soviet enemy. At one collecting point, 17,000 dead were left behind as their comrades trudged off to their final destination. Those too weak to continue the march were shot on the spot by their guards. Those who survived were claimed by typhus, cholera, and dysentery. These nightmarish conditions had not been anticipated in 1929, the year which saw the signing in Geneva of a new convention on prisoners of war. The convention stipulated that prisoners were to be adequately clothed, given food and quarters as good as those enjoyed by their guards, permitted medical treatment and exercise, allowed to keep their own belongings and remain free to practice their own religion and to receive letters and gifts of food, clothes, and books. The convention was to be administered by the International Red Cross organization. But in the Second World War, the writ of the Red Cross did not run to German prisoners in Soviet hands, nor to Russian prisoners in Germany. Moreover, the 1929 convention had not been signed by the Soviet Union or Japan. In the 1930s, the Japanese had invaded mainland China, fighting an undeclared war of great barbarity. But even the nations which had signed the convention had an escape clause. The war which broke out in Europe in 1939 brought with it increasing levels of privation. In Germany from 1942, these were to rise steadily. The convention allowed its signatories to cite operational necessity as a reason for not following the terms of the Geneva Convention to the letter. While German civilians went hungry and cold, so did the men shivering behind the barbed wire of the prisoner of war camps. Not so the Germans and Italians who went into the Allied bag in 1943 at the end of the campaign in North Africa. These men were to enjoy the comfortable conditions of camps in the United States. Nearly 200,000 German and Italian prisoners reached their final destinations in well-upholstered trains, fed on coffee and sandwiches. There were no death marches in the United States. In 1942, some 50 Japanese prisoners of war were shot and killed by guards when they rioted in a camp in New Zealand. But on the whole, prisoners were treated humanely in New Zealand and Australia. In contrast, Japanese treatment of their prisoners was brutal in the extreme. To the Japanese, surrender was a shameful act. Death was to be preferred to captivity. The Allied troops who surrendered to the Japanese endured appalling conditions. They were worked to death on projects like the Burma Railway, completed at a cost of 16,000 Allied lives and those of at least 100,000 Asian slave laborers. Of the 50,000 British troops captured by the Japanese, a quarter died in captivity. Those who survived were living skeletons. Conditions were markedly different in Western Europe in the early summer of 1940. In a matter of weeks, Hitler's army had overrun Holland, Belgium, and France. The French army, on paper the most powerful in Europe, had been shattered. Defeat was a bitter pill. Huge numbers of French servicemen and thousands of their British allies were now prisoners of war. In the earliest days of the Second World War, some POWs were housed in barracks. These British and French airmen were well cared for, and this was exploited for propaganda purposes, as this Royal Air Force pilot demonstrates.
I only wish to say, of my own free will, that since being taken prisoner here in Germany, my brother officers and myself have been treated with every courtesy and consideration. We have good quarters, adequate food, and no complaints.
But by the summer of 1940, the number of POWs had swamped the system. The Germans built numerous camps to house their prisoners. These normally consisted of single-story huts hemmed in by barbed wire fences. The camps were located throughout Axis territory, many in Italy, the majority in Germany itself, and there were also some prisoner of war camps in Poland. Life in the camps settled down into a routine. These photographs, taken secretly by a British prisoner, vividly convey the atmosphere in the camps. The looming guard towers placed around the compound. The harsh monotony of daily life. Primitive conditions, and long hours of boredom. Red Cross parcels went some way to relieving the deficiencies of diet in wartime Germany. And there was always time to work on your sporting skills. These POWs even contrived a cricket net. As time wore on, camp entertainments became increasingly sophisticated. Minstrel shows, and Shakespeare were part of the repertoire. Even the Wild West came to life behind the barbed wire. Meanwhile, the inmates of the camps used an ingenious array of homemade wireless receivers to keep in touch with the unfolding events of the war. In December 1941, the Japanese attacked the United States' great naval base at Pearl Harbor, plunging America into the war. Pearl Harbor was the prelude to a series of Allied disasters in the Pacific and Far East. Over the crackling airwaves, POWs in Europe listened with dismay to the dramatic news of the surrender to the Japanese at Singapore, the worst disaster in British military history. It would be some time before the litany of Allied setbacks was replaced by news of victory. As it happened in the First World War, working parties gave POWs a chance to breathe the air outside their compound. These Italian prisoners in England provided willing extra hands for the harvest. The Geneva Convention outlawed dangerous or military work for prisoners, but the Germans breached these basic provisions by forcing Allied POWs to work in armaments factories and mines. There was time enough to reminisce in the camps and to acquire new skills for the day when peace returned. Many prisoners chose to endure, but on others there was immense pressure to escape. The Allied High Command was particularly eager to recover highly trained officers and aircrew. It was a poor return on a huge financial and human investment to lose airmen over occupied Europe. The Germans knew this, and the camps in which airmen and officers were housed, respectively designated Stalag Luft and Oflag, were more heavily guarded than the Stalag camps in which other ranks were imprisoned. Stalag Luft III was situated at Segen in Silesia, which is now part of Poland. Life at Segen followed the well-established routines common to all camps. Boxers battled it out in the shadow of the guard towers. The inmates of Segen were also keen model yachtsmen. As summer gave way to winter, ice hockey on an improvised rink provided an outlet for pent-up energy. But at Segen, much energy was also channeled into the construction of 3 escape tunnels, codenamed Tom, Dick, and Harry. The tunnels were lit by tapping into the camp's electricity supply and fitted with rails to bring out trolleys of excavated earth. The telltale spoil was dispersed by being trickled slowly and secretly across the camp's parade ground. The tunnels were ventilated with pipes made of dried milk tins and bellows fashioned from 2 kit bags. In March 1944, 79 POWs were passed down one of the tunnels, Harry. On the direct orders of Adolf Hitler, 50 of the Segen escapers were shot on recapture. The Geneva Convention provided a maximum of 30 days solitary confinement for escape attempts. Only 3 of the Segen escapers made it back to Britain. Escaping was not the only skill acquired at Segen and other camps. The bribing and blackmailing of camp guards ensured a steady flow of information not only on transport and troop movements, but also the state of German civilian morale. Conveyed in coded letters home, these reports provided a useful backup to one of the great Allied intelligence breakthroughs of the war, the cracking of the German Enigma code by Allied codebreakers at Bletchley Park. To the end of the war, the Germans considered Enigma to be unbreakable. But the intercepted and decoded messages provided Allied intelligence with a unique insight into the German war machine. In the huts which dotted the grounds at Bletchley, the codebreakers were able to build up a picture of German war-making capacity and intentions. But if this source of intelligence was ever to falter, the reports from POWs would ensure that the Allies could still form a picture of what was happening in Nazi Germany. In the event, the breaking of the Enigma code remained the greatest Allied secret of the war. An insight into the crossover between Allied intelligence and prisoners of war is provided by the celebrated capture in early 1945 of the bridge over the Rhine at Remagen. An American manual on the security of escapers mentioned that the bridge at Remagen, upstream of Bonn, was likely to be unguarded. This was the bridge the Americans found intact, but no longer unguarded, when all the other bridges had been blown on the 7th of March 1945. For escapers and their organizing escape committees, the prospect of surviving for any length of time in Fortress Europe was a daunting one. In towns and cities, the Germans were everywhere. And behind them lay an army of collaborators and informers. Resistance organizations existed to help escapers and Allied servicemen attempting to evade capture. One of the most remarkable was the Comet Line, which ran from the Belgian capital Brussels through Paris and then over the Pyrenees to Spain and eventual safety in British-held Gibraltar. The Comet Line was run by a gallant young Belgian woman in her 20s, Didi de Jong. She and her Basque guides eventually escorted some 700 fugitives over the Pyrenees to freedom. Eventually, Didi was betrayed and sent to the concentration camp for women at Ravensbrück. She survived the war to become a nurse in Ethiopia. In London, the British had established a secret agency, MI9, to help escapers and evaders. The American equivalent was named MIS-X. Under the direction of Major Christopher Clayton Hutton, MI9 developed a staggering array of secret aids for escapers and evaders. Downed airmen could use convertible fleece-lined flying boots whose side pieces could be removed to become two halves of a waistcoat, leaving a pair of lace-up civilian shoes, with a flexible hacksaw blade concealed within them. The airmen were also provided with rustle-free maps printed on silk. MI9 devised a belt buckle which featured a tiny compass, a cigarette lighter which also concealed a compass. The compass was even hidden in the base of a cork bottle stop. Smuggled to POWs in their personal mail were items like this rice paper map, hidden in a seemingly innocent puzzle game. A chessboard revealed forged documents. A shove halfpenny board concealed currency and a hacksaw blade. Maps were hidden in cotton reels, or printed on the backs of playing cards. Commandos earmarked for raids on occupied Europe were also given careful training in evasion methods. But for security reasons, they were not provided with the names or addresses of any of the men and women living in the area of the operation who might help them. The importance of this rule was underlined in the run-up to the airborne raid on the German radar station at Bruneval in Normandy in February 1942. MI9 gave the operations planners a top-secret list which contained the names and addresses of French people in the area who had helped evaders in 1940. But in a potentially damaging breach of security, one of the planners at the headquarters of Combined Operations handed over the name and address of an individual on the list to a key member of the Bruneval operation. This was Wing Commander Pickard, who was to pilot the aircraft leading the parachute drop. Pickard memorized the name and address, but later told an MI9 colleague about them at the latter's wedding. It was an illustration of just how easily security could be breached and lives placed at risk. This address turned out to be of no use to Pickard, who was shot down and killed in February 1944 while leading Operation Jericho, the bombing raid on Amiens prison to free resistance workers held there. After the raid, over 250 prisoners made good their escape through the shattered walls. Early in the war, the Germans identified persistent escapers from their prison camps and decided to create a special camp to hold them. The site they chose was an 11th century castle, situated in eastern Germany, 12 miles from Leipzig and near the border with Czechoslovakia. The prison was designated Oflag 4C, but it was to become universally known as Colditz. 1939, Colditz had housed captured Polish officers. The castle presented a tough proposition for would-be escapers. It had a dry moat with a high outer wall. Beyond this was a drop of some 30 feet to terraced gardens, which themselves were built on top of a further wall. The castle was perched on a promontory overlooking the river Mulde. It appeared to be completely escape-proof. By the end of 1940, Colditz had some 500 inmates, French, Polish, Dutch, Belgians and British. To guard them and keep the prison's administration ticking over, there were 300 German soldiers. They were quartered around one of the castle's two main courtyards. The prisoners were crammed into the accommodation above the other. The castle was ringed by 18 watchtowers, equipped with machine guns. Sentries constantly patrolled back and forth between each pair of towers. There were always 2 sentries in the prisoners' courtyard. In addition, the German personnel at Colditz included a team of Abwehr intelligence men, who were dubbed ferrets by the prisoners. Special electrically operated sound devices were planted to detect any escape tunnels the prisoners might attempt to dig. At night, the castle was floodlit from all angles to enable the sentries to spot any attempt to climb Colditz walls. No one was supposed to escape from Colditz. This had a galvanizing effect on its inmates. Airy Neve arrived at Colditz in 1941.
It was a tremendously exciting thing to arrive at Colditz because we all wanted to get to Colditz, those of us who were keen escapers. It was really like getting in the first 11.
Each national group of POWs had its own escape committee. Its job was not only to coordinate all escape attempts, but also to gather intelligence about life in wartime Germany. Getting out of Colditz was only half the battle. The escapers had to be able to merge with the population at large. This was a daunting prospect for even the boldest of escapers. It was impossible to travel anywhere in Germany and occupied Europe without the correct identity papers and passes. If these documents aroused the slightest suspicion, arrest would swiftly follow. To obtain information on identity cards and passes, the escape committees bribed guards and closely questioned recaptured escapers. The prisoners then forged the necessary documents, and so skilled did they become that their efforts were indistinguishable from the genuine article. In many of the camps from which the Colditz prisoners were transferred, tunnels were a staple of escape attempts. In Colditz, however, tunneling was made immensely difficult, because any tunnel had to penetrate the castle walls and the rock on which it was built. Nevertheless, a number of tunnels were dug, using tools made from the prisoners' iron bedsteads. In 1943, the Germans replaced them with wooden-framed beds. There were no successful escapes from Colditz by tunnel. For his first escape attempt, Airy Neve disguised himself in a German uniform.
I walked out with the guard down the causeway to the main entrance of the castle, past one of the sentries, but then everybody realized that my uniform was bright green instead of field grey, and the reason, of course, was that I'm slightly colorblind.
But even in the disaster of almost instant capture, the resourceful Neve spotted another way out of Colditz.
The Germans took me over the drawbridge of the castle, and I saw the little wicket gate down into the dry moat, which meant that you could go down in that direction and not go out through the main entrance to the castle. Now, this was the gap in their defences that they hadn't seen.
Neve's new plan was based on another chink in Colditz armour, which had been discovered by members of the camp theatre. Neve takes up the story.
They discovered that under the stage of the camp theatre, one could dig a hole and drop down into a disused passage, which led to the doorway of the loft above the guardhouse, and that one could get down the spiral stairs there and out that way.
Neve planned his escape with a Dutch officer, Tony Lutyens.
We went on parade with German uniforms underneath our greatcoats, and we had German uniform greatcoats in boxes under the stage. We had to slip into the camp theatre without the guards noticing us before we could get prepared to drop underneath the stage on a rope of bed sheets into the disused passage, which took us to the loft above the German guardhouse.
The first stage of their escape attempt had been successful. Neve and Lutyens then made their way to the wicket gate, which Neve had spotted on his first escape attempt. So far, so good.
We reached the wicket gate without much difficulty, although a couple of German sergeants fell in behind us and marched with us onto the drawbridge. And we then opened the wicket gate and descended into the moat, which was covered in snow at that time, and we walked up the other side. As we did so, a German soldier came down the other side, and he was the only person to challenge us. He stopped in front of us and looked at us, and my friend Tony Lutyens, the Dutch officer who spoke very good German, didn't lose his head. He said, "Why do you not salute?" in German, very loudly, and the man saluted, and then he walked away, but it was a very dangerous moment.
Having disposed of their uniforms, Neve and Lutyens now disguised themselves as foreign workers sent to Germany as forced labour. An advantage to this cover was that the escapers did not have to be fluent in German. Travelling by train, Neve and Lutyens got as far as Ulm, hoping to reach the Polish port of Gdynia, but their papers did not allow them to travel any closer to the Polish frontier. They switched to local trains, which their papers allowed them to do, and approached the border by a roundabout route. Then they took to their feet, Neve following the railway across the frontier. He eventually reached the port of Danzig, now Gdansk, and spotted a number of neutral Swedish ships in the harbour. Neve selected one vessel, evaded the single sentry on the quayside, and slipped aboard. The crew agreed to hide him. On arrival in Sweden, Neve was first placed in a police cell, but then taken to Stockholm and handed over to the British Embassy, where he remained for almost 6 weeks before being flown home to Britain, where he joined MI9. As Neve and Lutyens had demonstrated, the effective use of disguise was one of the best tickets out of Colditz. At Christmas time in Colditz, thoughts automatically turned to home and how best to get there. One ingenious escape involved 6 POWs who disguised themselves as a German fatigue party. They got into a German sergeant major's office and penetrated a storeroom beyond it. Carrying boxes, they marched out of the storeroom, bluffed the sentries on one of the side gates, and made their escape. 4 of the escapers were soon recaptured by the Germans, but the other 2, a Briton and a Dutchman, steadily made their way south. Taking to the woods on the last leg of their journey, they reached neutral Switzerland and freedom. Another daring escape attempt from Colditz was mounted by Lieutenant Michael Sinclair, dubbed the Red Fox by his comrades. Sinclair closely observed a quiet part of the Colditz perimeter. His escape companion, Jack Best, recalled.
He watched it from one corner himself and the other side, a friend of his, every night for 9 months for about an hour during the change of routine from the day shift to the night shift of guards and the light perimeter lights coming on. And occasionally he found a weakness, and eventually it happened pretty regularly. There were still times when you could be seen. It was not, it had to be carefully timed with music. That was what had happened. You'd be somebody upstairs playing music. When the music was playing, you mustn't move. When the music stopped, you moved jolly quick. The first thing that had to be done was the window bars, 2 wires broken back, and about a 70-foot rope thrown out. On the end of the 70-foot rope was a briefcase and another rope of 20, 30 feet for the final drop. Mike went first. There was then about a 30, 40-foot drop. Unfortunately, both of us pushed up against the balustrade where there was a bell that the guards used when coming off duty to have the guardroom door open.
The noise made by the bell spelt the end of this escape bid. But it did not deter Sinclair, who was eventually shot dead as he attempted to scale the wire in an exercise area outside the castle. One of the most successful British escapes from Colditz was mounted in October 1942. The castle walls provided an escape route for mountaineer Major Ronnie Littledale and 3 fellow officers. Almost 50 years later, Littledale relived the route he and his companions took down the terraces to the barbed wire outer gate, which they scaled. Once again, the defences of the escape-proof prison had been breached. Littledale and Lieutenant Commander Billy Stevens then travelled south by train. Soon they reached the Alps. They left the railway and set off on foot for the Swiss border, lying up by day. They crossed after 5 days and gave themselves up to the Swiss police. The third of these escapers was Captain Pat Reed, a veteran of the Colditz Escape Committee. Reed remembered.
Of course, one thing I couldn't forget when I got across was to send a postcard from a post office as soon as I could get to one. And I think I used words to the effect that simple code language, wish you were here. Enjoying the snows of Switzerland, something like that, you see. And they got it, eventually.
Other prisoners tried to escape by hiding in trucks and vans which were visiting the castle with supplies and taking away dirty laundry, but they were usually discovered. Nevertheless, a number of prisoners remained at large for long periods before being caught and returned to Colditz. Some had the frustration of being captured within sight of the Swiss border. Many French, Dutch and Belgian escapers made for their own countries, even though they were under German occupation. But in the summer of 1943, these contingents were sent to other camps. The British who remained tracked the course of the war on a secret radio hidden in one of the castle attics. Shorthand writers took down the BBC News and read it to their fellow prisoners. Early in 1943, the Russians had besieged the German 6th Army in the city of Stalingrad. After victory at Stalingrad, the Red Army launched a new offensive which slowed to a halt in seas of spring mud that paralyzed movement on both sides. It was to be summer before heavy fighting erupted again on the Eastern Front. In July 1943, it was the German turn to take the offensive at Kursk. The entire campaign on the Eastern Front hung on the outcome of this titanic battle of attrition. German infantry and armour came on in the same old way, confident of victory. But they were stopped in their tracks. The initiative in Russia had passed to the Red Army. Colditz had now become an overwhelmingly British camp, its numbers swelled by officers transferred from other offlags after attempted escapes. The fresh blood helped maintain the determination of the original inmates, who had now been held in the castle for 3 long years. But thanks to their radio, the men of Colditz knew that the war was going the way of the Allies, who had landed in Italy in September 1943 and were pushing northwards. As one Italian town after another was liberated, the prisoners began to feel that the war was slowly but surely getting closer to them. Then, on the 6th of June 1944, came news of the Allied landings in Normandy. The success of Operation Overlord meant that the war in Europe was entering its final stages. In 1940, the British and French had gone into the bag. Now it was the turn of the Germans. As the Allied build-up continued, the Colditz Escape Committee placed a ban on any more escape attempts. They had been shaken by the news of the execution of 50 of the Sagan escapers by the Gestapo. But this did not halt work on plans for the most audacious of all escapes from Colditz. Flight Lieutenant Bill Goldfinch and pre-war racing driver Tony Rolt dreamed up a scheme that was remarkable in its audacity. Goldfinch had designed a glider which he was certain would fly. The tests caused some problems, as a fellow prisoner recalled.
They'd made a scale model of the glider beforehand. They'd catapulted it actually out of one of the windows into the courtyard. The thing flew and landed in the courtyard perfectly like a straightforward model glider. It so happened I was in the courtyard at the time, and one of the German officers was down there, one of the camp officers, Pupke, and he watched it and remarked that he was very glad to see the prisoners occupying themselves with something sensible instead of trying to escape. I agreed with him.
The glider was built in one of Colditz's attics. The basic materials were bedboards and sheets. Even the tools were entirely homemade. The plan was to launch the glider from the attic in the spring of 1945, when the winds were likely to be favorable. It meant a long wait through the winter, but Lockwood and Rolt were convinced that when the time came, the glider would carry them beyond the town of Colditz. However, in October 1944, with the Western Allies now approaching the German border, London categorically forbade any more escapes from Colditz. Victory was in sight, and there was little point in the prisoners risking their lives in an ever more desperate Germany. That autumn saw new arrivals in Colditz, General Komorowski and some of his officers. Komorowski had led the uprising of the Polish Home Army in Warsaw in August 1944, in the hope that it would help the advancing Russians to liberate the Polish capital. The Polish Home Army had fought for 10 weeks, but the Russians held back, and the gallant Poles were forced to surrender. After a hard winter, good news reached Colditz in March 1945, when the Western Allies crossed the River Rhine, Germany's last natural barrier in the West. Thereafter, the Allied advance was rapid, and the liberation of Colditz became increasingly imminent. But as the Allied armies drew closer, the inmates of Colditz were confronted by new dangers created by the collapse of Germany. The civilian population and significant elements of the German armed forces were now reconciled to surrender. The war was clearly lost. But the Waffen-SS and other fanatical Nazi elements were still prepared to put up a tough fight. They threatened to turn their guns on the prisoners at Colditz, who had refused to be marched to the east. One of the prisoners at Colditz was Colonel David Sterling, the founder of the Special Air Service, the SAS. Sterling was given the job of preventing a massacre at the hands of Nazi fanatics. Many years later, he recalled how this was achieved.
Well, we had to get at the individual who had given any such order, the Gauleiter of Saxony, based in Leipzig, and we forged a letter to him. The purpose of which was to frighten the Jesus out of him. If he in any way threatened our safety during the last stages of the war.
American forces closed on Colditz, where they fought a sharp battle with the German garrison before driving it out of the town. But the American commander seemed unaware that the castle housed Allied prisoners of war. His artillery was preparing to open fire on it. One of the POWs recalled what happened next.
One of the observation officers, forward observation officers, saw something colourful waving from one of the windows. This was the American sergeant in the forward observation post. And they were apparently had been given orders to eliminate the castle. That meant to demolish it completely, with all of us in it. Fortunately, this sharp-eyed chap saw this French tricolour and then our British Union Jack fluttering from the windows, and they grabbed hold of a young child or boy that they'd just captured or got hold of and said, "Who's in there?" And he said, "Oh, it's full of British and French prisoners of war." So he immediately got on the telephone and got back to his officer, back where the battery was, and told him, for God's sake, not to fire. And according to one story, which appeared in a wonderful book called Detour some years ago, it was something like 30 seconds from the time they were due to start demolishing the castle that the order to stop fire was given. The wonderful moment came around about 8 o'clock when the front gates opened and in walked this American GIs.
Now, like so many other prisoners of war, the men of Colditz could go home. Some of them joined the long, multinational columns of former prisoners, making their own way home. They passed columns of Germans marching into captivity. The wheel had come full circle. Most of the British prisoners were flown back to Britain. The war had bitten several years out of their young lives. Now it was back to demobilization and Civvy Street. For the escapers, Colditz had provided a perpetual challenge. But it was not until 50 years after the end of the war that Colditz's former inmates were allowed back. During the Cold War, the castle had lain in communist East Germany. It was an emotional time. Old men remembered the deeds of their youth. Once more they could see the evidence of their quest for escape. And relive the excitement and comradeship of those days. They had proved that walls and barbed wire did not make a prison. And the perpetual secret battle to outwit their jailers had kept their minds active and alive. Colditz had given them a glorious purpose.